everyone. My name is Jessica Gladstone, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the psychology department at New York University. And I'm here today with Dr. Jessica Decuir-Gunby. Her students call her Dr. DG. And she's a professor of educational psychology in the Department of Teacher Education and Learning Sciences and the director of graduate programs at North Carolina State University. So thank you for being with me today.
Thank you.
So let's get into it. The first question I have for you is, how can we as researchers help create more inclusive learning environments?
I think there are a lot of different ways and different strategies that we can use. As one really easy way is that we can actually make our courses and classes more culturally representative, particularly in kind of expanding the way we actually create our curriculum, particularly the types of readings, for instance, the types of readings that we use actually include more authors of color or more readings that come from that talk about diverse topics, particularly people of color, LGBTQ issues, people with disabilities. Particularly, for instance, we're teaching classes on motivation. There are a lot of topics about motivation topics. That, for instance, regarding people of color or regarding LGBTQ issues. But a lot of times in our classes, we tend to only focus on the canon or focus on the traditional readings. And so we exclude a lot of populations. I think it's just really easy just to kind of expand the kind of class, the kind of topics that you actually include in the class. And so students want to see themselves in the curriculum. And when students don't see themselves, they're not as engaged and not actually as motivated, for instance, in a motivation class, to actually be engaged with the topic. And so that's just one really easy way. For instance, when Toni Morrison just passed away, I remember one of my teachers in high school had us to read The Bluest Eye. That was the first book I actually read with a Black female protagonist. And I actually could see myself in the novel. Just imagine if we actually had readings and activities where students can see themselves. And how easy is that for teachers to actually do? We also need to help to value the diverse experiences that students bring to the classroom. So many times that, we have this, we're so used to doing the same activities in our classes, but students bring a wealth of knowledge to the to classes, and we only tend to value only certain kind of experiences. But I think we have to realize that everybody wasn't raised the same way. Everyone doesn't come from the same kind of background. Everyone doesn't have the same kind of experiences. But you just never know who's in your classrooms, what they actually bring. And we have to figure out ways to engage those students and let them bring those things to the classroom. And once we do, we just don't know what kind of activity, what kind of knowledge you're actually going to have in the class. For instance, I actually teach a program. We have a lot of non-traditional students. And I will tell you that we learn a lot from the non-traditional students. So we have a lot of the traditional students that come to, they go through undergrad and go straight to graduate school. And then we have students who kind of come back, they're teachers, they're older. And, we have that mix of students in the classroom. We have that mix of experiences. The students learn so much from each other just from, just from the experiences of just life. And so when you allow the students to kind of be the experts themselves based on their life experiences, it makes the class so much richer. And it brings the theories that you're teaching to life. And so having real world applications like that really does help students to kind of understand the theories that you're teaching. And then as teachers, you have to get to know your students. Realize that it's not all about you in the classroom. It's about getting to know who they are as people, as individuals. And so I think, people tend to do that in K-12, but as college professors, that's important for us to do too. So I think that's one easy thing for us to do. And a harder thing for us to do as universities as a whole, we actually need to be, to do a better job as recruiting and retaining more diverse faculty and students. We need to bring people from a more variety of backgrounds. And so if we have a wider variety of students in our classrooms that we're teaching, so we're going to end up with more experiences in the classroom. If we have more diverse professors, we're definitely going to have more diverse experiences, and they're probably going to bring in different types of activities in class, different types of readings in the class. And so I think as a whole, as an academia, we just need to have a lot more diversity, as racial, ethnic, with different experiences, LGBTQ, people with disabilities. And I just think that we just need to spend more time from that perspective.
Great. That's a really detailed answer. Thank you. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk more from like a methodological point. And so another question that I have for you is one of the major challenges in studying underrepresented groups, particularly questions of intersectionality, is that of sample size. So do you have any suggestions for overcoming this barrier?
Well, we have to go where underrepresented groups thrive. You know, we can't expect them to actually just show up to our doors in academia. And so, so we have to do a better job of cultivating those relationships. And so we, as researchers, we have a study, we just know, oh, I need, this is what I need for my sample. And we just kind of expect, to just, I don't know, they just kind of come and walk to our door. But, if you want you want to actually have that representation in your study, you have to work to get those people in your study. And it's not going to be easy because a lot of communities of color, for instance, they aren't very trustworthy of researchers. And so you have to be able to go and build those relationships. You have to build trust, and you have to give back to those communities. You just can't go and take. You got to be willing to give something. And as researchers, we have plenty to give, and it's not always monetary. I mean, you could just go. We have a lot of knowledge, and we are graduate students. We have a lot that we can give back to those communities. And once you develop that sense of trust and relationship, they'd be willing to open doors, and you could come in and collect data, and then so it becomes mutually beneficial. But we have to be willing to do that, and so we have to establish those relationships and develop a sense of trust. But I think the bigger issue is that we have to expand what we think is valuable in terms of research. I think we, in particular in educational psychology, we are just so set on quantitative methods. And don't get me wrong, I love doing the really data intensive type of methodology. I think you answered some really good questions doing that, but we also have to be open to answering research questions that don't necessarily require those larger samples. And so for instance, we have to be more receptive to things like qualitative research that may not necessarily require those big samples. And so if we, for instance, were more open to qualitative methodology, we will see that there's a wide variety of things that we can do within qualitative research that we can really answer some really great questions. So for instance, we could do some in-depth, observations of classrooms, or just observations of, for instance, we brought up intersectionality, really look at identity in a lot of really interesting ways by, for instance, utilizing case study or ethnographic kind of studies methodology. But because we pretty much privilege quantitative methods, we would never get there because we're just not interested in really being open to qualitative methods in that way. But in recent years, we're starting to see people being a little bit more receptive of qualitative methods, particularly through mixed methods approaches. But there still is a more, even with the mixed methods approaches, there still is a preference for more quantitative dominant mixed methods approaches. There's still a heavy quantitative research slant, which is a little qualitative work. So it's pretty much people will be focusing on a quantitative perspective with the qualitative aspect to support the quantitative findings. So it's still all about the quantitative aspect, which is we're just going to do just a little bit of qualitative part just to kind of support what we find for quantitative. So there still really isn't a strong push for qualitative methodology. So I do think if we really are interested in studying underrepresented groups, and if you can't really get access to those large populations, we have to be willing to expand our methods. Because I know some, for instance, I live in the South, and so I have access to, different, large pockets of for instance, of African Americans. But some people may be in parts of the country where they may not necessarily have access to large groups of underrepresented groups, and so you may have to think about using different methodological approaches. And if that's the case, we as a field need to consider, maybe, there are a lot of really great, questions that we can answer with quantitative methods, but maybe we need to consider, branching out a little bit. And they're going to, and we may be able to answer some really great things and really be able to expand the field or look at some of our constructs, some of our common constructs in a slightly different way and really add to the research literature.
Yeah, that's great. I know during the panel discussion last year, the invited session, there was talk about the importance of using qualitative research to also help develop quantitative surveys for people, because we know
Right.
that different groups can read and interpret items in different ways. And a lot of the surveys, motivation surveys that have been created, were created with heavily white middle class samples. And so it's important that when we're giving these surveys, that we're looking at the questions being asked
Hmm.
and understanding whether or not those questions equally apply to different groups. So I think what you said is really important for us to keep thinking about.
Right.
And so I have one more question for you, and this is kind of continuing off of what you just said, but a lot of quantitative research to this point often includes race as a control variable. And so how can we as researchers move past controlling for race as a variable, and what types of methods can really help us accomplish this?
Well, I think from my perspective, I may be taking a perspective that's a little different from most people in our field. Is I think the problems we too often treat race as a demographic variable, when I think it's much, much more than just a demographic variable and something that we should control for. I think we should be looking at race as more of a social cultural variable, and we should be focusing on individuals' experiences that are associated with race, and particularly within schools, because there's so much. Just look at what's going on right now in our world today, particularly what's going on right now, just in our society, that are race-based and race-focused. And so, so it's more than, whether or not they are white or black or a Latino. It really is about whether or not that, how people see them, how people see you based upon your race. How you may treat yourself, see yourself based upon your race. And so all of that kind of all that impacts kind of who you are and what goes on in schools. And so I think if we start looking at race in that way, and particularly, particularly with motivation, I think we'll learn so much more. But I do think there are times when we have to do examine group differences. And so I do realize that race is an easy categorization. And I know that, we sometimes we do gender, or sometimes we do socioeconomic status. And I know sometimes we just have to do that to examine group differences based upon on people scoring on different constructs. But I think, as you mentioned, the problems that many of our measures and instruments have not been normed using people of color. And so I think we do have to go back and figure out, which constructs have been properly normed and which ones have not. So it might mean that we just have to go and create a whole new set, or have to kind of tweak a whole or revise a whole bunch of them. Because I think too often this has led people to make deficit-based decisions, deficit-based conclusions, and make decisions that have been detrimental, particularly to people of color. And I know particularly to African Americans, there have been a lot of decisions that have been, made, have made a lot of deficit-based decisions, and so which have really ruined the lives of a lot of people. And so so measurement is really important. And so I know you talk about what types of methods can help accomplish this. I think all of them. I think we really need to think about just psychometrics in general. Qualitative research, as you talked about, plus good skill design involves qualitative methods. Is mixed methods as a whole, because you have to do the qualitative, which followed up by skill design. And then once we actually have good skills and instruments in place, we actually have to really have good, rigorous quantitative methods. And so it's everything. But we have to make sure we have representative sampling all along the way. So I really think, so methods as a whole is really important, particularly as we're training the next generation of scholars, that, we really should be training them to be proficient in all of the methods that we can. I mean, my mentor, Paul Schutz, he told me that I should take, when I was a graduate student, a methods class every semester. He said, it doesn't matter if it's quantitative, qualitative, it doesn't matter. I just want to make sure that you are taking a methods class every semester, because it's really important for you to be proficient in research methodology, because you need to be able to understand how to conduct good research. Regardless of your research question, I want you to be able to conduct good research. And I think that's the way we need to train our students, because you want them to be able to answer whatever question they need to answer.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. So those are the three questions that I had for you today. And so I really want to thank you for joining me today and answering those questions from a very critical perspective. I think this is really going to help us continue this super important conversation. And I know we're all really looking forward to reading more of your upcoming research. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, so now if there's anything else that you want to extend upon or other questions that you think are important to include in this, we can definitely do that now.
But I'm glad you brought that up about critical perspective. I definitely think that is one part that's really missing in the field is that for too long we have not had a strong critical view or perspective in our field. And I definitely think that is something that I think is longing and growing in our field, because I remember at the session at AERA, there were at least a couple of I'm going to say graduate students, but I don't want to misspeak, but definitely younger scholars that actually were questioning, saying, where do we get that training? I want to ask these questions, but I don't really see a lot of that work in our field. I don't really see a lot of people, we don't get to read that in the classes that we're taking. But these are the questions that I'm having. I want to ask these questions, but I don't really get that. When I read the readings in our field, I don't really see that. So where do I go to find that in our field? So I do think that there is a yearning for that kind of work out there in our field. So I definitely think that that is an area that is ripe for our field to kind of grow, the whole critical lens, the kind of a critical educational psychology perspective. So, I mean, it could go many ways. It doesn't necessarily have to go a racial way, but that's definitely a natural fit. But that is critical in terms of disability aspects or LGBTQ aspects or gender. So there's a lot of different ways that it actually can go. But I definitely think that's one area that we need to look into, because I think we have a new generation of scholars that they're interested in the traditional educational psychology constructs, but they want to look at it in a different way. And I think that faculty need to be receptive that, maybe students don't necessarily want to do things the traditional way. They want to do things maybe a slightly different way. But I think the question becomes, how do we get faculty who may be open to that, but they don't know how to do that themselves. And I think that's the next frontier that we need as a field need to kind of look into.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. And some of my own research that I've been doing, we've teamed up with some statisticians to look at differential item functioning on heavily used motivation surveys among males and females and among
Mm-hmm.
African Americans and non-African Americans. And the results have been really surprising, with a lot of these different groups interpreting the items in very different ways, which has
Mm-hmm.
huge implications for the actual construct itself and how it relates to outcomes. Because if these groups aren't responding to these items in the same ways, how can we compare findings across all of these different groups like we have been for years?
Right. And I think what's really important, they may be responding to the items in a different way, but that doesn't mean one way is better than the other. They're just responding differently. And then our job as researchers to find out, so what does that mean?
Mhm.
Why are they responding differently? And
Why?
they're responding differently. So what's going on? Why do they see things differently? Or what's happening? Or, then, so is it wording of the questions? Or is it that, maybe they just see this differently? Maybe it just operates differently. But I think, for too long, we have seen it as different. So this group is better, or is different. So they're not as good as. And I think we need to change that way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think this is where the importance of qualitative research comes into play, because being able to ask students, okay, how did you interpret this question? And seeing if they did actually interpret it the same way or not, and getting to the root cause of why they may be answering those items differently.
Right. I would also like to see us do a lot more. If we can do it, because I know it's hard to get in school sometimes, to do some kind of observations, kind of really was seeing what's going on with kids in schools. Because, it's one thing you can ask kids on a survey, what do you think about this? But then to kind of see them in action, actually engaging in some of the things that we're talking about, so you can kind of see for yourself what they're doing, see what kind of high level thinking and interactions that they're doing. Because I think sometimes, the kids, they may not necessarily be truly giving themselves credit for what they're actually doing in the classroom. You might be like, "Whoa, I mean, look at this kid. They're really doing some high level stuff here." But when you ask them on the survey, they're like, "Oh, no, I really don't do that." And so I think so a lot of times there may be some paradoxical kind of stuff going on. So like, why did you say this here? But yet when I saw you in action, you were doing that. And you just never know. So I think there's a lot of room for some really great things that we can do methodologically. We just have to be willing to kind of expand the way we do. But once again, it gets back to our being willing to make connections with these other communities and building trust with those communities and be willing to give our time to those communities and give of ourselves to those communities, but not just willing to just take from those communities.